Hey guys, it's Sean over at AVADirect, and just like Intel, we're shaking things up a bit this week, and I'm going to be showing you a little bit about the new Intel chips, the i9-9900K and the i7-9700K. Now, before we get into things a little bit too much, we will be getting rid of Joe this week. He will not be joining us again. I have replaced him permanently.
Okay, let's get things started.
What you doing, Joe?
Oh, I'm starting the Intel 9th Gen video.
You didn't hear?
Hear what?
We replaced you. Somebody else is doing this video.
Somebody, I got this.
Joe, sit down.
Alrighty guys, so before we get too much into what the chips are, we're going to go over how we did our testing and how we handled everything internally here at AVA. Now, for both chips, because they use the same socket, we were able to use the same test bench, memory, video card, motherboard, all that fun stuff. So everything I'm going to say here is for both the i9-9900K at stock and overclocked, and for the i7-9700K, both stock and overclocked. So for the video card, we have just a GTX 1080 Ti from NVIDIA. That is a Founders Edition card. The board we have here is a Gigabyte Z390 Gaming SLI. Functionally, what you want to keep in mind with this board is it is mid-range. This isn't a super high-end $600 board, nor is it a cheap $100 piece of crap. This is kind of going to be right in the middle where a lot of you guys are going to end up being. So these numbers are going to work out really well for what we're going to see in the real world. Other things we have in this is we have Windows 10 Pro on an Samsung 850 1TB SSD and a G.Skill 2x16 3200 gigahertz kit of memory. So now that we have all that covered, we also have an AIO sitting here from Enermax, keeping the chips cool. And again, that remained the same throughout the whole testing phase. Alrighty guys, so to get into this a little bit, we're going to start out doing the 9700K at a stock speed on this board, and then we're going to take a look at the 9700K overclocked. And then by that same token, we're going to do the exact same thing with the i9-9900K. So to start out, what we're seeing is Intel has made a pretty big adjustment this generation. What we saw in the last couple, if you take a look at the top end of the i7s that Intel's had in the past, the 6700K, 7700K, and 8700K, to take a look at the three most recent. Now, if you look at those, the 67 and 77 were pretty much the same CPU, same socket, same core count, same thread count. What they did with 8700 was they kind of did what you expect to see out of CPU companies. They upped the core count, upped the thread count, left everything else pretty much the same. Now, what was interesting this time with the 9700K coming out of Intel is they completely got rid of hyperthreading. What this means is that if you want to take a look at, for example, the 7700K and the 9700K, now on the surface they both have 8 threads or cores, if you want to call it like that. However, when you actually get into performance, specifically gaming, you're going to see that 9700K outperform it theoretically, simply because rather than having 4 threads and 4 cores, it just has 8 straight cores. Now, what's interesting with this is that this is the first time in recent memory that Intel has gotten rid of hyperthreading in their i7, which is kind of interesting. This is also them adding in the i9 product line, which we'll touch on a little bit later. So what we're kind of seeing here is not only is Intel coming out with new chips, they're doing a couple really interesting creative things, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but they're actually kind of changing the way their products are segmented. They're changing who buys i7s, who buys i5s, who buys i9s. That's becoming a little bit more dynamic than we've seen in the last couple years. So to get a little bit into the chip itself, the 9700K tested pretty well. If we want to talk about our tests internally, Cinebench, we got about 180 FPS. That went up by about 2.5 to about 3 frames per second when we overclocked the chip. By that same token, we saw our Cinebench scores go up a little bit. If we're talking about single-core performance, by only about 6 Cinebench points, if you want to call it like that. But in the multi-core, that went up by about 100. So we're seeing you get overclocking gains with these chips, especially in synthetic benchmarks. And actually, after having a conversation with Zach, one of our techs that actually helped us do a lot of the benchmarking on it, he mentioned that he liked how these chips overclocked. He preferred it to a lot of the other processors he's worked with, and compared it in terms of ease of use to the 8086, which, if you don't know, is essentially a binned 8700K. And in terms of chips for overclockability, is one of the best on the market because it's binned the way it was. To get into a little bit more, the other things that we're seeing with the 9700K is an MSRP of right around $385. You'll notice that's pretty close to where the 8700K is. So what we're seeing here is not only are they adjusting how they're handling their product segment, they're actually keeping pricing fairly stable, which is appreciated. The other thing we're seeing is, as opposed to a lot of the previous chipsets, when you get into higher end stuff, the boards aren't ridiculously expensive. You can still spend $600 on it, absolutely, but you can also spend $150 and still get a completely passable and functional board. Now we've gotten a little bit into that, we'll hop over to the 9900K, and then once we get through that, we'll talk a little bit about just the overall gains that Intel's made, talk a little bit about the soldered TIM, or the solder rather than TIM under the IHS, which actually has made a massive difference in overclocking, and we'll get into a little bit more about the overall platform, because when it comes to CPUs, as I'm sure you guys all know, CPUs matter, but what you plug the CPU into does as well. Hey guys, now that we've looked a little bit at the i7 9700K, we're going to take a quick look at a little bit of the benchmarks and put those up on the screen so we can take a look at all of the hard numbers. And then we're going to delve a little bit more into the i9, getting into the new soldered IHS and all the other fun stuff that we're seeing from Intel. Alrighty guys, next we'll be taking a look at Intel's i9 9900K. Now with the i9 9900K, what we're seeing is Intel is repositioning their product lines a little bit differently. In the same way that last generation, the top of the line was the i7 and it had hyper-threading, we're seeing the same thing this generation, except it's called i9. Now, one of the other differences is that core count has gone up. 6 to 12 was the last generation's max that we saw, at least on consumer grade chips. With 8700K and 8086, what we're seeing this time is the i9 9900K has 8 threads, 16 cores. So what we're seeing is, in the same way that Ryzen kind of bumped up the lowest common denominator or lowest amount of cores that you can really get in a consumer grade chip, we're seeing Intel try and push the envelope in a similar manner, trying to get everybody into a little bit of higher end chips. Something that's interesting about that is you will pay a little bit of a premium for it. It's about $499 when compared to some of the other chips that it's going to be directly competing against, like this guy right here, the 8086K, which is essentially a binned 8700K. With that being said, though, we'll get a little bit more into kind of where the i9 is and why you would want it. Now, the i9 is a little bit different than the i7 that we saw this generation, in that the i9 is kind of a true prosumer chip. The new i7, the 9700K, what we're seeing with that is it's 8 cores, and that's it. No threading, no hyper-threading, nothing like that. So it's going to be mainly focused for people doing tasks like games and more specific things. With the i9 9900K, what we're seeing is it has that 8-core, 16-thread combo. So if you want to take this and compare it to a Threadripper system, in a lot of cases in high-end workloads only, Threadripper's probably going to do a little bit better. And by that same token, if you take a look at the i7 9700K and compare that just gaming performance to the i9, they're going to be pretty similar, or the i7 is going to probably take a little bit of an edge, especially in price to performance. But if you are like most people out there, you're not using your rig for one thing. You're using it for multiple things. You're streaming, you have Chrome open, you're listening to music, you're doing video rendering, you're doing gaming, you're doing everything on top of that. That's kind of where this i9 sits. It positions itself very, very well at the top of Intel's consumer product line, in that you can do rendering with it. It has the horsepower behind it. It has the clock speed. It's kind of your everyman chip at a higher level. So what we're seeing with this is, again, Intel is really trying to, it seems, change the way that they're taking a look at their product segment. The i7, which is super recognizable, seems to be going a little bit more towards the gaming side of things, whereas the i9 seems to be getting a little bit more into that high-end prosumer. One thing I will say with this, though, is it's still early. We don't know. So one of the other things that we'll be doing here is our test results we all have out of this bench. one of the things that we would like to see is, because we're a custom shop, a lot of our guys, a lot of our production staff have opinions. They like to tinker. They like to do overclocks. They like to see how things feel. So what we'll be doing in the next couple weeks is we'll be updating this video. We're going to delve a little bit more into not only the chip, how it's performing and how it's benchmarking. We're actually going to bring in a little bit of the opinions of the guys that build these all day. For instance, I had a conversation with our one gentleman today, Zach from production, that was incredibly interesting, where he brought up the fact, interestingly enough, that while first generation Ryzen and Intel, you compare the two, it seems like Ryzen has the price to performance difference because of memory timings and everything like that. Intel actually competed a lot better than you thought. So what we'll be doing is, in a couple weeks, we're going to come back with an update to this. We're going to do a little bit more apples to apples in terms of people that have had hands-on time with, I like overclocking this chip, I don't like overclocking this chip, and here's why. So we'll be taking another crack at this, but overall right now what we're seeing is these chips are actually benchmarking okay. We still have to wait a little bit. I'm sure you guys have heard about the third-party benchmarks that weren't entirely accurate coming out. So we'll be taking another crack at this, or we'll be verifying our test results for that as well. So stay tuned for that. All right, talking about the new chips, of course we're going to talk about the fact that Intel finally decided to go back to a soldered IHS. Now, for those of you that don't know, the way processors go together is you have your chip, which has some gold contact pieces on the bottom which allow it to fit into the socket. On top of that, you have your actual CPU. And then on top of that, you have what's called an IHS, or integrated heat spreader. Now, the way that these three are all put together is they're essentially sandwiched together, and there's a little bit of silicone that holds everything in place. And in much the same way as to get a CPU cooler onto a CPU, how you have to have a little bit of thermal paste in between, you have to have a little bit of thermal paste between the top of that CPU and that IHS. Now, in the past, what Intel did, and AMD does, is they used to solder them, meaning that was just metal, which means that the heat transfer was good, and you really didn't have to worry about screwing with that at all. The past couple years, what Intel did is they got away from that, and they went with a TIM IHS. Thermal interface material is what it's referred to as, but essentially they would put more thermal paste between the IHS and the CPU. Now, what we saw with this is, in a lot of cases, like your consumer grade chips, your lower end chips, and even ones that you didn't really want to overclock at all, really didn't make much of a difference. Got a little bit hotter, but nothing too crazy. Where that really hit was in overclocking. Now, what we used to do, or what a lot of people used to do, is something called delidding, where you can actually take that chip, break it apart, and then you put metal in there and then put it back together, get rid of that goop, put something a little bit better in there. What Intel's done this time is they've decided, you know what, nope, we're going back to solder. Now, realistically, this probably increases their costs a touch, but what we're getting out of this is huge. So first, you're seeing overclocking performance has gone up, not necessarily in terms of clock speed, but in terms of temperatures. And we'll get a little bit further results, and we'll showcase this a little bit more on the next one. But essentially what we're seeing is, if you take an older chip, an 8700K, and overclock it, a lot of times you see a jump of about 20 degrees Celsius when you get that OC on just in temps. With the soldered AHS, you still get those jumps, but it's not nearly as much. Usually about 10 degrees from what we've seen so far, but we will want to take another look at that. So what we're seeing with this is, not only do you not have to worry about delidding and potentially screwing up your chip, you also are going to get a little bit better performance out of it in terms of overclocking. So this matters to, I'm guessing, a decent amount of you. But if that's not something that is super prevalent in your mind, or you're not too interested in overclocking, the other thing to keep in mind is that these chips are not crazy expensive compared to last generation. Yeah, they're a touch more, but it's not like they're causing the price to jump up by about $100. Which brings us a little bit more into allocation on these chips. Intel has put out some good chips this time. They really have, and I'm excited to see where they go. However, we are seeing some allocation issues. But that's working out in our favor in a lot of cases because of people like this. So if you're taking a look at the i9s and i7s that are recently coming out, absolutely take a look at them. If you're a gamer, though, start taking a look at some other things. A lot of these chips are designed for that prosumer. If you're looking into gaming, take a look at going with a Z370 with an 8086K. It's going to perform pretty similarly and is available. That's the other thing that we're seeing with Intel. Apparently they are having a little bit of a shortage on the production end. We're not sure what it is or when it's going to end. Fingers crossed it'll be soon. So that's something to keep in mind, is that yes, these new chips from Intel are absolutely wonderful and we are really excited to see more out of them, but We're not sure how allocation is going to be to start out with, so keep that in mind. Alrighty guys, so those are two of the new Intel chips, the i9-9900K and the i7-9700K. Both are available now on our store, though one thing I will caution everybody is there may be allocation issues. Keep in mind, as soon as we get these chips in, they will be going in builds and we will be shipping them out. So allocation is really not going to be an issue on our end. It'll be coming things directly from Intel. If you ever have questions or anything of that sort, just give us a call. We are more than happy to hop on the phone with you and tell you exactly what the lead time for that specific chip is right now, and also to tell you at what point you are in the line. So if we have 50 on order, we can tell you that you're number 4, or whatever it may be. Another thing we want to get into a little bit is we will be revisiting this video once we get a little bit more time with the chips, and once we have a chance to have our assembly team actually take a crack at it. And that way we get to see how some real bona fide nerds take a look at this stuff and how they like it. So please go ahead and follow us on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook at AVADirect. I've been Sean. Thank you very much. Don't forget Instagram.